Is Age of Overlord format the best Yu-Gi-Oh format in years? In fact, is it so good that it's even worth going back and doing Time Wizard events specifically for this period? Now, I don't think I'm necessarily going to change anybody's opinions with this video. A lot of this stuff just kind of comes from observations that I have made going to a very, very, very high-powered locals with like regular regional toppers playing at it and playing on their level, and having gone to a lot of events like preceding Age of Overlord format and during Age of Overlord format. Now, in order to explain why so many players considered Age of Overlord format to be so good, we kind of need to go back in time a couple formats to kind of explain what was happening in the state of the game at the time. And I think how Age of Overlord was kind of a culmination of sort of a trend that was already happening. So after Photon Hypernova comes out and Tier 0 is just absolutely eviscerated, just tier limits just absolutely destroyed, Cashier was now the new best deck. If you look at events from around that time period, obviously Cashier has a lot of representation, but you'll see a lot of other decks also showing up in topping, like top 64s, top 32s of YCSs, of regionals, etc., etc. But the problem is that Kashtira just was so oppressive compared to everything else that Arise Art just banishing things from either player's graveyard just stopped like almost like a lot of things. And so the game is not really as diverse as it could have been. It's not until you see Arise Heart leave the game that you see a lot of this like diversity of the game start to spring up. I mean, there are a lot of decks that you see that had been released in the prior couple years. I mean, stuff like Branded, stuff like Sword Soul, Fluon Deriz, I mean, later on, you'll get Centurion, you'll get Salamangreat with the fire stuff. There's a lot of like great tier 2, tier 3 rogue level decks that had already existed in the game for years at that point. You could play the game at like a competent level, but there's just a lot of like BS stuff that was really keeping them out. So the game was building up a lot of these like competent decks that were playable, but again, lost to Arise Heart. And then the Arise Heart ban totally changed all that. So really, even by like September, we were already kind of like in this like nice Goldilocks zone where there was a lot of playable decks, and there were like top decks, but they weren't like so much more powerful than everything else that they just wiped everything off the face of the earth. That they could make strong boards that were a pain in the butt to get rid of, but it wasn't like all the time. And then Age of Overlord comes out. Now, Age of Overlord obviously introduced the whole Diabellstar engine, so stuff like Fire Kings that got released later, or Rescue Ace, obviously could do their whole thing. But what I think the main thing that Age of Overlord kind of introduced that really changed the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Worked was probably the two best cards in the set, in my opinion. What was Typhon and SP Little Knight. Now, Typhon's a very interesting card in my opinion because it really discourages kind of the wombo combo boss monster spam that Yu-Gi-Oh! Really has a bad reputation for. Typhon really put a check on just all these giant guys that had negates attached to them and be like, nope, you can't activate your effects, and I'm just gonna get rid of you. The other card was SP Little Knight. SP Little Knight is definitely, I think, way more powerful than I think almost anything else in the game at this point. It's just absurd how much like this single Link 2 does, just banishing cards from either field or grave on summon if it uses like an extra deck monster as material, banishing 2 things if anything is activated, which is insane. But SP Little Knight kind of encourages these kind of interactions that are not negate-based, but are still incredibly strong. Now, with the introduction of the Diabellstar engine and Rescue Ace, we had another top deck. Now, I know people will argue there's other decks that are better in AGOF format. I still think that Rescue Ace is like the best deck, being able to build the whole board of like an SP Little Knight, plus maybe some negates if you have a cracked hand, and the whole set 4. Maybe you have another thing in your hand, set 5. That is like an absolutely insane board. You get a lot of these like top decks, obviously, that are strong and can build insane end boards, but all kind of like could play against each other, kind of, that certain decks couldn't handle up against other decks. And like a lot of the tier 2, tier 3 decks could definitely take a bite out of those bigger decks if you kind of knew how to play. And again, because those Typhon and SP Little Knight were generic, that a lot of decks could use those and engage in that same kind of gameplay. So it was something that you really did have to consider, like having those cards used against you if you were the top decks. Age of Overlord definitely was a very diverse format. I mean, I played against a lot of different decks at the regionals I went to very near the start of the format when I didn't realize yet how good the format would be. And I think over all the different locals that I went to from like October to the end of December, I think I played against like almost every playable deck in the entire format at least once, which is crazy. That's a lot of decks. That's like double-digit like amount of decks, like maybe like Smash Brothers Brawl, like roster size into the 30s amount of playable decks that were possible in the format. Another thing that was really cool about Age of Overlord is that it really felt like there were a lot of different kinds of engines in the format. There's a lot of like experimentation going on with like mixing different kinds of engines together, but the engines like were discrete enough from each other that you really necessarily couldn't combine all of them together into just one big pile. I think about like the Horus engine, right? You could play like a Bestial Horus deck. Obviously the Diabellstar stuff. You could play it obviously in Rescue Ace and in Fire King. You also could play it in like TG as well, which is kind of cool. You could play it in Synchron as like a big adventure Synchron pile. Runic, another big thing, right? Not even a 2023 release, but Runic, such a huge thing that you could splash in anything else that Joshua Schmidt at YCS Bologna took the whole event with Runic Bestial. I think that the format still has a lot of like untapped potential. Just, I don't think we've really seen the full potential of what some of these engines could really do. And that's kind of where the Time Wizard discussion comes up, right? People obviously very much enjoyed the gameplay of that format, right? I mean, you had lots of different deck types with lots of different play styles. You had Tyr as your gamble deck. You had Rescue Ace as this kind of this control-ish kind of deck. You had Unchained, just like as sort of a slower kind of mid-range kind of deck. You had Labyrinth as like the trap deck. All these like bazillions of other play styles in like the lower tiers of gameplay. Now, I know this might sound crazy considering modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, but I think the format actually slowed gameplay down a fair bit. In fact, it was such a big thing that I was concerned in like the deck building process and even during gameplay, like during a game, that like, oh, I think I'm gonna run out of resources. That like turn one, I have a decent amount of resources and I have a decent amount of follow-up and stuff, but I might run out of stuff to throw at my opponent if I couldn't push through on like turn two or something. And obviously the best card in the format, SP Little Knight, encourages games to go longer because the Banish stops you from direct attacking that turn. So if you try to threaten combat after you make an SP Little Knight and you banish, that's really not going to work. The battle phase like is actually kind of important for cleaning stuff up, but you're not like necessarily killing your opponent like turn two or turn three sometimes. Also, ironically, I think the reason why Age of Overlord might be a popular Time Wizard format in the future is because of the price. The Horus engine and the Diabellstar engine were just so ridiculously expensive at the time, and I remember playing against them a lot at locals, but obviously those are people that were able to spend $500, $600, multiple hundreds of dollars worth on cards, whereas even like a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh player, like the average person was not paying that much. And so I would not be shocked that when someday the Diabellstar core is like $10, the Horus core is like $10 or something, that people will go back to this format and just kind of like play a lot of these decks that maybe they had seen but never played as itself. Now, is Age of Overlord worthy enough of a format to like have dedicated Time Wizard events to? Obviously, I think the gameplay is good, but I think not yet. Obviously, we just left the format as of January 1st, 2024, as of the time I'm filming this video. So I think it's a little too soon to just immediately just go back to it and explore it. But I think the game has to go through like a pretty significant paradigm shift in order for people to want to go back to Age of Overlord. That I feel like it's really peak kind of Yu-Gi-Oh! Of like sort of the kind of modern play style of like set up your board turn one, and your opponent not only has to set up their board turn two, but also try to crack that board. It's just like the most dynamic and interesting kind of form of that gameplay. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Has to evolve into something kind of like Ishizu Tier Limit format as kind of like the base gameplay standard where both players can play on each other's turn, no matter which player's turn it is. So that way, the game is just so different in how it works that I feel like people are going to have to pine for Age of Overlord and like, oh, those days when the gameplay was like this. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. I was really inspired to make this video. I don't know, I just saw a lot of internet comments talk about how, oh, Age of Overlord format is so good. We should have it as a time wizard, again in the future someday. I don't know, I just kind of want to put this video out there, kind of see what people think. I certainly think that Age of Overlord was like a pretty good format. I kind of recognized by the end of it that it was really, really good. When I played at my corresponding regionals, it was very, very early in the format. I think it was like a week after the set came out. I didn't realize how good it was at the time, so but I definitely do now.